wonderful Adidas sweatshirt here, I bet it's full of synthetic thread, so to speak. You know what I mean? Not natural fiber. What's a natural fiber? Cotton or wool, right? A lot of these shirts like we have on are synthetics, okay? Now, what's the advantage Mrs. Durr likes about synthetics? Because I've never done this in my entire life of 38 years of marriage, never picked one up in my life. No, never picked one of these up in my life, so my wife likes synthetic materials. Irons, right? They don't wrinkle. Synthetics wrinkle less than natural fibers. So people that didn't have time to iron or never learned to iron because their mother took care of them when they were young, and my poor wife inherited that bad part of me. My wife loves synthetics because they wrinkle less easily than natural fibers, and they became very popular in the 1920s among people who were busy, who didn't have time to iron. Another invention that kind of went on with synthetics was cellulose. And that was also a synthetic fiber, but it was used as an alternate to silk and rayon. If you had a silk shirt, that was pretty big deal, cost you some money, right? Well, all of a sudden they made cellulose that would replace silk, and you'd have the silk-looking shirt at half the price, so to speak.
They replace silk in what?
Rayon, R-A-Y-O-N, rayon, which is another kind of fancy thread. How about another thing? I just used some of this last night when I was putting hamburgers in patties to save for barbecuing this summer. Cellophane was an alternative to wrapping paper. When they used to wrap up your meat at the meat market, what they use? Brown paper, right? Now they have this cellophane. The great thing about cellophane is you can tell what's wrapped up in that paper because it's clear. Okay? So cellophane. This was a synthetic fiber that was an alternative for wrapping paper. I'll tell you where a lot of technological changes were made that started what we have today that was very productive in the 1920s were advances in the field of medicine. Anesthesia. Did I put that on your sheet? I think I did, didn't I? Yeah. You think those poor boys in the Civil War, what kind of anesthesia they get when they cut their leg off? Bite on this leather belt, buddy. You know what I mean? Bite on the leather belt. Well, anesthetics came out, or anesthesia, and it was a new technique used to make surgery not only safer, but a lot less painful. Okay, Sully will be very thrilled with anesthesia on Friday, because taking those wisdom teeth out live would not be any fun, and you cannot bite on anything when they do that, so I don't know what they would have had to do. Okay? Phenobarbital was another invention in the 1920s in medicine. Phenobarbital. Anybody know what that does? You don't. We had a lot more of these in the old days, but we kind of made some advances in medicine. If you had an epileptic seizure, they gave you phenobarbital. That would get your seizures under control. Okay? So phenobarbital was invented to control epileptic seizures. Now, thank God for this next guy. I'll tell you what, he ruined my life. Dr. Alexander Fleming. Anybody know what he invented in the 1920s? Penicillin. You ever heard of that? Well, I'm going to tell you something. When I grew up, if you had a sniffle, my mom was a bit of a hypochondriac. I love my mother, but boy, she took care of her only child. If old little Randy ever got as much as a little sniffle, she rushed me to the hospital or the doctor, and what did they do? Gave me a penicillin shot right in the buttocks. I got so many penicillin shots during my young life that I became allergic to penicillin, and I could no longer take penicillin because it would cause me great danger and death possibly. So I have one of these cards that says no penicillin. So anytime I go to the doctor, I have to have some amoxicillin or some substitute. But penicillin, I'm telling you, was the cure from 1920 till probably 1970. If you had anything wrong with you, boom, 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 penicillin. I think there's a lot of people my age in this country that are probably allergic to penicillin because how much was pumped into you when you were a young child, because it was the miracle drug at the time. If you had a cold, penicillin shot. Okay, if you had the sniffles, sore throat, penicillin shot.
And isn't that stuff like really thick too? So it's not like you
Well, you could feel it when it was inserted, I would tell you that. It wasn't the needle, it was the burn of the insertion. Always got me. Another disease that was, two diseases that were brought under control in the 1920s because of the advancements in medicine were tuberculosis and smallpox. A lot of people died of tuberculosis and smallpox prior to the 1920s when proper medicine was developed to get those under control. So diseases like tuberculosis and smallpox were brought under control because of the advances in medicine in the 1920s. Now, how does this all make sense? Prior to the decade of the 1920s, the average life expectancy of an American, believe it or not, was what? How long were you going to live? 49 years. 49 years was the life expectancy of a human being prior to 1920. Because of the advancements in medicine, by 1930, that life expectancy increased from 49 to 59. So because of advancements in medicine in the 1920s, the life expectancy of an American increased 10 years from 49 years to 59. I am at the top of, well, I'm way past one and I'm right at the other. So remember, if something happens to me, we're going to cremate, dig up a tile in the middle of the room right under Rachel's desk, stick me in there and forget it. Okay? All right, for you musicians, we're going to go to the Jazz Age. The Jazz Age. The American sound, baby, in the 1920s. The Jazz Age. We're going to test old Andy Denise out, see what he knows about jazz. He got all excited about it. Now, remember these new radios that came out in the 1920s? Well, of all the music that poured from these new radios into the homes of Americans, none was more typical than jazz. Jazz was what most people listened to and was pumped into their homes by this new radio sensation. Okay, Andy, if you don't know it now, you will. Where was jazz born geographically? Geographically, it would be north, south, east, or west. This is the United States. South, what particular city? Come on. New Orleans, that's right. So born in the South, notably New Orleans, jazz music blended these three things together. Okay, born in the South, notably New Orleans, Louisiana, jazz blended these three things. Andy, what is jazz made up of? Where'd it come from? No, anybody? Go ahead. Come on, let's get deep. Way back. God, you tell Mr. Rose about this today, because I'm telling you, he'll be impressed. Come on, jazzers. Who's in jazz band in the morning? You don't even know what the hell you're playing? It blended West African rhythm. West African rhythm. With black work songs from the days of slavery, combined with European harmonies. So born in the South, notably New Orleans, jazz music blended three things: West African rhythm with black work songs during the slavery era and European harmonies. Those three sounds put together what we knew in the 1920s as jazz. Some of the first great jazz musicians were of African American descent. They were Negroes, which included Jelly Roll Morton, who was a jazz composer. I'll repeat these, so don't panic. Bessie Smith, a female jazz singer, and more famously, Louis Armstrong, a jazz singer and trumpet player. So three of the more famous jazz musicians of the 1920s were of African American or Negro descent, which included Jelly Roll Morton, a jazz composer, Bessie Smith, a female jazz singer, and Louis Armstrong, a jazz singer and trumpet player. Jelly Roll Morton, jazz composer, Bessie Smith, a female jazz singer, and Louis Armstrong, a jazz singer and trumpet player. Hey Andy, true or false? I'm going to give you a 50-50 chance here. Jazz music was not only composed by African Americans. True or false? Jazz music was not only composed by African Americans. In other words, I'm saying, did white people compose and produce jazz? They did, that's true. Not a lot. And it occurred actually, this occurred actually before the 1920s in 1917, where the original Dixieland Jazz Band became the first all-white jazz group to make recordings. Way back in 1917, prior to the decade of the 20s, the original Dixieland Jazz Band became the first all-white jazz group to make recordings. 1917, the original Dixieland Jazz Band became the first all-white jazz group to make recordings. Now, Andy.
All right.
He's popping up. Jazz music started in New Orleans. What two areas, big cities in America, did they spread to that really made an impact on the northern part of the United States? I'm going to give Andy a shot here, then Josh, I'm going to throw it at you. It spread from New Orleans to where to where?
I have no idea.
From New Orleans to?
Well, New York City?
Before that. He's right.
Chicago?
Yeah! Woo! Man, these guys are on fire today.
Tag team effort?
Jazz music spread first from New Orleans to Chicago and then to New York City, specifically in which area of New York City? What do you say? Harlem. That's right, Harlem. So in 1917, the original Dixieland Jazz Band became the first all-white jazz group to make recordings, and then jazz music spread from New Orleans to Chicago to an area of New York City known as Harlem. And they started having the springing up of nightclubs where these jazz musicians would go. And the most famous nightclub probably was that one in Harlem that was known as the Cotton Club. The Cotton Club. The most famous jazz musician to perform at the Cotton Club on a consistent basis was the great jazz musician Duke Ellington. The most famous jazz musician to perform at the Cotton Club in Harlem on a consistent basis was the great jazz musician Duke Ellington. All right, any questions on that? Movies in the 1920s. Yeah, movies. Now I'm going to give 5 points extra credit to the first person to tell me a familiar name or a family name that invested a bunch of money in the movie business in the 1920s. Didn't make a lot of money on it, but what's a big name? Yeah. Who? No, good guess.
Like the company?
No, not an individual family, a person actually. Okay, yes? We'll give you some information, maybe you'll figure it out. Now, the motion picture is what they were called. When they never called them movies, they called them motion pictures. Why? Because your pictures were in motion, right? Okay, so the motion picture became very popular during the 1920s. And after World War I, a suburb of Los Angeles, California, emerged as the movie capital of the world. Hollywood. Very good. Hollywood. So, after World War I, a suburb of Los Angeles, California, emerged as the movie capital of the world, which was Hollywood. Now, movies were silent until 1927. So from 1920-ish to 1927, you had silent movies. And the audience read the words on the screen to follow the plot of the movie. You ever watch a movie nowadays where the people speak in Spanish or some other foreign language and they have the words underneath? Okay, this is like the whole time. If you have closed captioning, okay, it'd be like turning off the sound of your TV and completely watching the closed captioning. Okay? And that's how movies worked until 1927. And you think that would be horrible, which I might too, but in those days that was a big deal. Man, oh man, these had motion pictures with words. Holy smokes.
Wait, so they were silent movies until when?
1927. Yep. Now, you know when you watch a film now, usually at the end, what do you get at the end? It tells you who the actor, who played what, who played this. Well, in these silent movies in the 1920s, especially the early ones, they did not identify the actors or actresses. So people would go to these movies and see 2 or 3 movies and go, gee, look at that handsome Hispanic boy in that movie. God, I've seen him in the last 3 movies. Next time I see him in a movie, I know his picture's on the poster, I'm going to go see him. Because, man, I think he's awesome. I don't know who the hell he is, but he's awesome. So the early films did not identify the actors, and soon movie studios discovered that Americans had their favorites as far as actors and actresses. And they also figured out that people would buy tickets to come and see certain actors and actresses. And as a result, the age of the what began? Movie star. The movie star came into being as movie theaters started to figure out, my God, people are coming to see that debonair Hispanic stud. Oh, by the way, his name is Andy Denise. And so the next time they start putting names on posters and say, oh man, hey, I tell you what, if I can go to a Robert Duvall movie or Clint Eastwood, I'm telling you what, I don't care what the movie is, I'm going to watch it because I like Clint Eastwood. So do I like all the movies he's ever put out? No, but I watch them because he's in them. You know what I mean? And that's where the movie star began in the United States. Here's some famous actors and actresses. I don't even want you to write them down. Just look at them on your ID sheet. I'll tell you a little bit about it. Okay? Clara Bow. John Barrymore. Now he's got a tie to somebody. John Barrymore is some famous actresses. Drew Barrymore's great-grandfather. Ever heard of Drew Barrymore?
Yeah.
This is her great-grandfather, John Barrymore. Charlie Chaplin. What was he? What was he? Kind of a comedian, kind of in comedy. Very good. Lillian Gish. The Angelina Jolie of the 1920s, in my mind. Gloria Swanson. Woo-hoo! She actually had an affair with a pretty famous rich man in the 1920s and 30s whose son later became president of the United States. Anybody want to guess? Gloria Swanson had a little go with a very wealthy man who made most of his money in the illegal liquor business, by the way.
Eisenhower.
No, this guy's son became president of the United States.
Well, that narrows it down a lot.
Well, it should. And his son also was the first Roman Catholic ever to be elected president.
Kennedy.
Joseph P. Kennedy Sr. He was also the guy that financed and spent a lot of money getting the movie business going. Well, he kind of got a liking for Gloria Swanson, and look out. How about Greta Garbo? You know what she was known for? Just being a good actor. Douglas Fairbanks. Douglas Fairbanks. Good looking gal. These were all your first movie stars, actors, actresses that people took interest in. Clara Bow, John Barrymore, Charlie Chaplin, Lillian Gish, Gloria Swanson, Greta Garbo, Douglas Fairbanks. Okay? Now the star couple, who's a star couple now that always stars in the same movies? Can you think of anybody that's always in the same movies? Well, kind of that, but I mean sometimes, it's not so much anymore, but it used to be. But anyway, the two that became the star couple were John Barrymore and Lillian Gish. They always guaranteed a big profit at the box office. People would come to see those two if they starred together. Now, you might write this down, two of the very first famous comedians in the 1920s were Laurel and Hardy. Laurel and Hardy. Anybody know what the appearance of those two fellas? They were stand-up comedians in the 20s, Laurel and Hardy. Anybody want to guess? Mutt and Jeff. Jack Sprat could eat no fat, his wife could eat no lean. What was the appearance of these two? One was really robust and the other one was very skinny. Laurel was very skinny and Hardy was very robust, I guess would be a thing to put it. They were kind of an odd couple together. And they were the first real comedians. Okay, that'll take us to heroes in the 1920s. And we're going to end with that today. Heroes in the 1920s. And then tomorrow we'll talk about the Great Depression, when all this joy and wonder that we're talking about goes, okay, late in the 1920s. So, heroes in the 1920s. What type of heroes do you have? You have sports heroes, you have regular heroes, you have people that accomplish things that are heroes. Well, there are many heroes established during the decade of the 1920s. And what helped create these heroes? Not television, because we didn't have it yet, but radio. So radio helped create instant heroes in the 1920s as it broadcast news into millions of homes across the nation. First person we'll talk about, fittingly, is a woman hero, Gertrude Ederle. Gertrude Ederle. Anybody know what she did? You should know this, Elise Russell. This is right down your alley. She must have been